Evening. I want to make sure that this isn't just totally a lecture at you. I'm going to go through some of the background material here, try to pull things together. But ultimately, in the end, what is going to be really important to me is conversation. I'm going to break after a while and ask for your questions, your comments, because this is a part of the world that sometimes can put people to sleep, and just because it's so little known to most people. Some of you might have traveled there because back before COVID hit, the New York Times was doing something called the New York Times Journeys, and they had one called the Silk Road Journey. And I was the lecturer for that for 2 years. And what we did was go to the great Silk Road cities of the Middle Ages of Samarkand, Bukhara, and Khiva, and saw things like you could just never see anyplace else in the world. So I'm not going to be able to really tell you a whole lot of what those places are like because you have to see them. But what I want to do is give you a little bit of background here on the whole region and how it fits together into the world and how it plays its games with the world. Now, Central Asia has been a part of Western consciousness since at least the Middle Ages, when Marco Polo navigated the famed Silk Road that linked Western Europe and China. And you know what? We're talking about that again today, talking about linking China with Europe, but this time it's with the middle corridor, which is essentially the Silk Road. But I'll get to that a little bit later. In the 20th century, however, Central Asia was not at all in the consciousness of the United States as a specific region with specific countries, simply because the Soviets had conquered and incorporated it into the Soviet Union. I can think of only one time when one place in Central Asia was prominently in the news back in the 1970s, and that was when Henry Kissinger stopped off in Tashkent, Uzbekistan, on his way to Beijing to set the stage for President Richard Nixon. But otherwise, people had just never really heard of this part of the world because it was behind the Iron Curtain. And that Iron Curtain was pretty solid for many, many decades. Now, when the Soviet Union unexpectedly fell apart and dissolved at the very end of 1991, the Soviet republics of the Soviet Union became almost automatically independent states, whether they wanted to be independent or not. And very few of them had ever thought about independence. They had never talked about independence. They weren't agitating for independence, but they woke up and, oh my God, we're independent. Now what? Quite an unusual situation in the world. The United States immediately recognized the independence of these 15 new countries, 15 counting Russia, and established bilateral relationships and American embassies in every single one of the new capitals. And at that time, we said, our very first policy at that time, we said that our fundamental policy was to protect and preserve the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of each of the new countries. And you know what? That policy has continued to this day. You hear it again and again. Most recently, you heard Joe Biden say it in New York City in September when he met with the 5 Central Asian presidents for the first time ever. And in his press statement after this meeting, he again reiterated this policy that we have been talking and saying out loud for the last 30 plus years. Now, at the beginning of these countries' independence, the US foreign policy infrastructure kicked into gear, but it didn't take into account that these countries were radically different from those in the West. The way that the West organizes its governments and its economies and its social cultures is based on the great ideas of the Western Renaissance, the Reformation, and then the 18th century English Great Enlightenment. And that's where our society thinking and our governments come from. These countries had none of that. For the previous 70 years before their independence, they'd been Soviet socialist republics. And before that, they'd been associated with Tsarist Russia for several centuries, of the history of which went directly back to Byzantium, not through the thinking of Western Europe, and bypassing all the reforms and reformations of the West. They were equally influenced by their Mongol forebears in China and in many cases by local nomadic traditions. So they were radically different from the United States. Now, on an individual level, people are people all over the world. I mean, you can go anywhere in the world and talk to someone local, and you feel like you're making some kind of a connection that way. We can all communicate and get along on a one-to-one basis. But people's cultures, societies, and economies can be radically different. And that was the case with these new countries. Our diplomats, bless their hearts, threw themselves in heart and soul to build relationships with these new countries because they were absolutely certain that they were just yearning to breathe free and become free market economies like the rest of the world should be, our diplomats said. Well, that's not how they were thinking. Um, and when they didn't respond to our lectures about human rights and corruption in government, we soon resorted to finger wagging and naming and shaming that we continued for the ensuing decades. And that pretty much set the tone for the first quarter century of our relationships. Now, to look at it another way, each of these new countries, each in its own way, more or less followed the Soviet example of a strong leader at the top, supported by a powerful intelligence service. So for the Soviets, think the KGB. And that intelligence service wasn't at all against working with organized crime and organized criminal leaders. Now, some of those criminal leaders came to be, after independence, came to be called oligarchs. And some of the oligarchs then became national leaders, even though they had started their careers in organized crime under the tutelage of the KGB. Once again, let me tell you, it's a very different part of the world. I think there's probably no place else in the world that really does follow that kind of pattern. And you know what? It's only now, 30 years later, that there's a new generation that was born after independence. Some of them educated in the West, who are now coming to power in both the public and the private sectors. And they are now beginning to change their countries in ways that we find more recognizable. So, what I've given you so far is a bit of the way the United States has looked at this region of the world. But there are other world powers that play big games here too. Now, first and foremost is Russia, and then increasingly it's China with its Belt and Road Initiative and the growth, as we've already mentioned in passing, of the importance of the Middle Corridor as a result of Russia's criminal war in Ukraine, and then also the European Union. So there are essentially the four great powers that aren't playing a new great game. In fact, the United States adamantly says we are not involved in a new great game. What we're doing is giving them an option. And if they choose to pick up on this option, then we're glad to work with them. But we are not there to compete against others. Russia has long, or not just Russia, but Putin himself has long declared the former republics of the Soviet Union as Russia's sphere of influence. And he often says special sphere of influence and wants to do everything he can to keep them within Russia's bailiwick. Now, the United States rolls its eyes and tut-tuts, says, oh, there's no such thing as sphere of influence. But I'd ask you, how do we look at the countries of Central America, how do we look at the Caribbean? Don't we sort of see that as our sphere of influence too? So there's nothing wrong with talking about a sphere of influence, but the countries have to be independent enough and have enough independence that they can make their own decisions about it. Um, it was really interesting after 9/11 what happened. Because at that time, even though Russia did not want the United States messing around in its backyard, Putin immediately talked to Washington and he said, "You are welcome to set up temporary military bases in Central Asia to fight against the terrorists in Afghanistan that have attacked your country." And so we set up a temporary military base at Karshi-Khanabad in Uzbekistan, southwest Uzbekistan, and another one in Kirghizstan at the Manas airfield. And so we had for several years two US temporary military facilities there that were fighting the war in Afghanistan. And we were doing this with Russia's permission. But Putin sort of got cold feet after a while and didn't like very much having us there. Wanted to find ways to get rid of us, wanted to find ways to push us out. And over a period of time, he was able to do that. Excuse me. Russia has two international organizations that it has created for especially the countries of the former Soviet Union and especially for Central Asian countries. One is called the uh, CSTO, the Security Treaty or Commonwealth Security Treaty Organization. This is a military organization that most, not all, of the countries belong to, and supposedly it's like a mirror image of NATO, so that when one member is attacked, the others are supposed to come running to help them out. Well, you know what? The CSTO for years and years was bumping along. There was an attack in Kyrgyzstan, in Osh, Kyrgyzstan, by Uzbekistan in the early 2000s. CSTO, even though they were asked, never responded. During the various fighting across the Caspian between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh, and we can talk about that later if it's of any interest to you. Armenia asked several times for help from the CSTO. CSTO never answered. The CSTO, in the 20 some years of its existence, 25 years of its existence, has been deployed only once, and that was for 8 days in January 2022, when there was what looked like business violence in Kazakhstan, but there were actually two things going on at that time. There was oil field business violence, but there was also a parallel attempted coup d'etat going on at that time. And so Russia did deploy several hundred CSTO members, but only for just a little bit over a week. And after they really weren't needed that much anymore. Russia has another organization that it created for its former republics, and that is called the Eurasian Economic Union, EEU. And again, some people think that Russia wanted to make this parallel to the European Union, so that there would be the Russian version, there'd be the Western European version. And once again, not all the former republics are members of the EEU, but many of them are. The problem is that the EEU benefits Russia more than it does its members. It gives Russia access to the markets of these countries, whereas it still blocks a lot of the products from these countries going into Russia. So it's helpful for Russia, but not much for anyone else there. Interestingly enough,
That the justices
These countries,
unlike other
it's is someone asking something there?
No, someone was unmuted. You can go
Oh,
ahead.
okay, never mind, never mind. Um, Let me go on then. Let's move over to China. For the longest time, China, which is right on the border of Central Asia, was not a great player there, but it was certainly a player. And it created something called the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, for years and years, even for its first couple of decades, was just sort of considered a talk shop. It never got anything done. But over the years, it's become a respected talk shop so that the countries do find that they can talk to each other and to others in the neighborhood through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. In the end, though, that's not what's really important about China. What's become important about China is that in 2000, 2013, in the capital of Kazakhstan, which is Astana, a new capital way up in the north, in the middle of nowhere, but amazing with its architecture if you ever see it online. Anyway, China at Nazarbayev University in Astana announced something that has come to be called its Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. And what that is not just for Central Asia building infrastructure, but all through the Indian Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, other places into Europe. China is expanding itself in many, many ways that it had never ever done before when it wasn't quite as wealthy. And so the Belt and Road Initiative has become really a big deal for this region. Um, and now, with the problem of Russia's war in Ukraine and the problem of closing off things going through Russia into Europe because of sanctions, all at once what's called the Middle Corridor, the old Silk Road, the old Marco Polo thing. That has become of real interest again. The problem with the new Silk Road, with the Middle Corridor, is that it's going to take a huge, massive amount of infrastructure to become really viable for the long term. But an awful lot of that is already underway. It's being built. And so let's keep an eye on it. It could become one of the new major trading zones of the coming years, coming decades.
You want me to share the map of,
Yeah, please. If for people who don't know the region well, us get that up there. You got me at a good time because I was about to move to something else. There we go. Okay. You see the Caspian Sea. Look at the countries that surround it: Russia and Iran, and then Central Asia. Look how big Kazakhstan is compared to the rest. And then the smaller countries off to the other side of the Caspian, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, they are becoming just as important as Central Asia. Uh, uh, and that's where the middle corridor goes. China is building across Kazakhstan, across into Azerbaijan, and then through Georgia, up that way, or down through Turkey, now called Turkey, into Europe. So this is an absolutely fascinating part of the world there, all of those countries. Let's no, let's look at each of the countries right now. Okay, I'm going to start with Kazakhstan. It's almost 4 times the size of Texas. It's a huge country, but it's a population of just over 20 million. So, but it's really the key country in Central Asia. And apart from the northwestern bit of it on the other side of the Ural River is technically in Europe. Most of it is actually in Asia. And so it is truly a Eurasian country. It's different from the other four countries in Central Asia, not because of its Eurasian geography, but primarily because of decisions that the first president made very, very early after independence. The first president was Nursultan Nazarbayev. He was in line to become a member of the Communist Party Politburo just before the fall of the Soviet Union, but he never made that. Instead, he became the president of independent Kazakhstan. And you would think that because he was about to become a member of the Politburo of the Communist Party, that he would have been a dyed in the wool communist. But in fact, he wasn't. And we're seeing that in some of the other leaders that came to the surface there too. Let me give you a few of the three of the important things that Kazakhstan did very early that has set it apart from the other countries in the region and has made it a world player. Um, from the beginning, it committed itself to macroeconomic reform away from the Soviet command economy. And so, what that means is that today, 30 years later, its banking and its financial systems are on a par with Europe's. They're not quasi Soviet, they're not strangely Chinese, they're really European. And that has made a huge difference in the way that Kazakhstan can do business in the world. Uh, Second, and this is probably even more important, President Nazarbayev decided that if Kazakhstan were to be an independent country that emerges onto the world stage, it would need a new generation of leaders that think differently from the past. And so, what he did, even before Kazakhstan started to pull in the billions of dollars from its natural gas and oil fields, what he did when there wasn't that much money available, he created something called the Bolashak program. And Bolashak is the Kazakh word for future. It was a future program. And what it did was give young Kazakhstani students the chance to study abroad, not just an exchange program for one semester or for even 1 year, but their full college education abroad. And then for some of them, not only just a bachelor's degree, but a master's degree, also paid for by the government. So that now, a couple of decades later, there are probably, the numbers vary depending on who you're talking to, but there are at least 16,000 alumni of this Bolashak program who were educated in the West and are now coming to positions of authority both in government and in the private sector. That doesn't exist in the other countries in the region, and it makes a big, big difference. Um, Third, and this is really of special importance, you know, when the Soviet Union fell apart, it had its nuclear arsenal in several different parts of the Soviet Union. And Kazakhstan had a lot of the Soviet nukes. And so, what's of special importance is that Kazakhstan declared itself a nuclear non-proliferation partner of the United States. At its independence, it found itself with the fourth largest nuclear arsenal in the world. But President Nazarbayev committed to total denuclearization of his country, in part because in the 1950s and 60s, the Soviet nuclear testing devastation took part in northeastern Kazakhstan. That's where they did all of their testing. And it devastated the land. And to this day, there are still thousands and thousands of people who were harmed by the above ground nuclear tests. And that was one of the main reasons that Nazarbayev wanted to get rid of all the nukes anywhere in his country. I had the real honor when I was ambassador to Kazakhstan to go to Semipalatinsk, in the northeastern part of Kazakhstan, because working with the United States for 10 years, we had cleaned up enough highly enriched uranium and plutonium from a site on the Caspian Sea, right on the shore, called Aktau. It was the BN 350 nuclear reactor. And we cleaned up enough highly enriched uranium and plutonium that could have made 775 nuclear weapons if it had fallen into the wrong hands. And what we did was build a special facility up in northeastern Kazakhstan where we could lock down this stuff under the United Nations authority for at least 100 years. And I was one of the people who gave a speech during that day. It was quite amazing to be in that kind of a situation. Okay, so what Kazakhstan also has done that's very important is set up something that is called multi-vector foreign policy. And what that means is it tries to be good friends with Russia, it tries to be good friends with China, it tries to be good friends with the United States, it tries to be the good friends of the European Union, maintaining at all times its own independence and never falling into the clutches of one or the other. And that multi vector foreign policy is what has become popular for all the countries of the region and of the former Soviet Union. Okay, let's look at a few of the other countries quickly, but then it'll be soon time to go to your comments, questions, and things like that. Kyrgyzstan, the Kyrgyz Republic. Little country right against China, wedged between Tajikistan and Kazakhstan, wrapped into Uzbekistan. And soon after independence, the US government in public said that Kyrgyzstan is the Switzerland of Central Asia. It's the Switzerland of the former Soviet Union. It didn't mean mountains at all, because in the very earliest days, Kyrgyzstan was pretty democratic. It had initially some free elections. It had private sector freedom. It had all kinds of public people working together to build a new country. And it looked really, really good. But sooner or later, and it was really sooner, the old system kicked in. And so when we talk about Kyrgyzstan, it's now one of the two poorest countries in the region. It does have gold, and China is has monkeying around with the gold mine in Kyrgyzstan. But Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are the two poorest countries there. Um, let's go on down to Tajikistan. This is the second most mountainous country in the world. After which country? Believe it or not, Nepal. Nepal has more mountains, but Tajikistan is right on its tail. Immediately after independence, 91, 92, Tajikistan fell into a north-south civil war within the country. And it became just ghastly. People being killed left and right. Uzbekistan mined the borders. Uzbekistan was taking sides during the Civil War. And for 2 years, that raged on until the West started talking with the people there. And they sort of pulled a leader up from the trenches. And that was someone named Rachmanov. He's now, like many people in the region, dropped the Russian off, and he's now just simply President Rahman. He did a good job at the very beginning. He was quite admirable, but what he did was fall into the trap of running the country sort of like a family business and running it into the ground with all kinds of corruption and corrupt business people. So it is really a very sad, it's a beautiful, gorgeous country, but it's a sad country at the same time. Okay, Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan, people thought at the beginning was going to become the true leader of independent Central Asia, simply because it had the highest population, about 35 million at that time. It was highly modernized. It had lots of factories all throughout the country. It had 98% literacy. It had a good school system throughout, but it fell further and further and further behind. And why was that? It was because the first president of the country was an old Soviet and ran his country as if he were an old Soviet soldier. And so it wasn't until he died in 2016, uh, President Nyazov, and the new president, Mirziyoyev, came to power. Mirziyoyev had been the prime minister to the president. And so no one expected there'd be much change at all. But as soon as Mirziyoyev became president, woof, all at once, reform after reform after reform after reform, he and others were just waiting in the shadows to try to reform the country. And so now they're 20 years behind, but Uzbekistan is working hard to achieve the same kind of reforms that Kazakhstan has had for the last 20 years. Let's jump over to the final one there you see in pink on your map, Turkmenistan. Turkmenistan often is joked about as the North Korea of Central Asia, the weirdest country of Central Asia. And quite frankly, it's weird, and no one can explain why it's weird. None of the experts truly can. What happened was that the first president um, used the money that was coming in almost immediately from the natural gas because Turkmenistan has the fourth largest natural gas reserves in the world. What he did was use that money to build what they called the white marble palaces of the capital of Ashgabat. So that when you are in Ashgabat, when you drive through Ashgabat, you have these immensely amazing white marble buildings and palaces and monuments and everything else. But you look around and say, where are the people? Is this a real city or what? You know what? You go 2 blocks off the main avenues with the white marble palaces, and you're in the real city. So, yes. But as weird as that country can be, the people themselves keep their heads down. They're wonderful people. I lived there for a year. They're wonderful people, but they don't care whether the government is doing that in their own backyards or not. Because of the gas and oil, there are two pipelines that have been in the works for just the longest time. One is called the Turkmenistan, yes, Turkmenistan, uh, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, TAPI, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India. And the idea is to get the natural gas from Turkmenistan flowing down into India, which needs it as it builds with its more than billion people now. But Turkmenistan is not willing to help build that in the other countries. It says the other countries are responsible for its being built. So you can imagine what's happening with Afghanistan these days and the Taliban. They're not really big into spending what money they have to build pipelines like that. So that one has been in the works for a very long time. Another one that is really, truly important, if it ever gets built, is the Trans-Caspian Pipeline, TCP. And what that would do is take gas from the port of Turkmenbashi across to Baku. And then there's already from the 1990s and the 2000s a Western built natural gas and oil pipeline system that goes through Azerbaijan, Georgia, Turkey, and into Europe. And what that would do is get Turkmenistan's natural gas into Europe, which badly needs it right now because of the way things have changed with the war in Ukraine. Where does Turkmenistan sell most of its gas? The lion's share, the huge amount of it, goes in pipelines that were built over the last 20 years from Turkmenistan to China. Now, Turkmenistan tries to get a little bit of its gas to Turkey by swapping it through Iran. But that has not really worked over the years and over the decades. Why? Because Iran doesn't pay for it. Turkmenistan doesn't pay for it. They get into shouting matches about who's not paying for what they're not paying for, and it just falls apart. I was very surprised this morning to see a news report that Turkmenistan has a new agreement to send gas through Iran to Iraq to help the rebuilding of Iraq. So we'll see if that actually happens or not, but I am sort of leery of that. Okay, that covers the 5 countries of Central Asia. Let me say the United States, these countries on their own have begun to work together to look at the future together only in most recent years, because for the first several decades of their independence, they were focused on their own countries. And they had leaders who weren't all that interested in working with others in the region. That's beginning to change. And that's a very, very positive development. In 2017, the United States set up a program called the C5, Central Asia 5 plus 1. And we began to meet at the foreign minister, our Secretary of State level with these countries. Now, the countries themselves set up a whole bunch of other C5 plus ones. There's a C5 plus Russia, C5 plus China, C5 plus Japan, C5 plus South Korea. Why South Korea? Because during World War II, the Soviet Union moved a large number, hundreds of thousands of Koreans to Central Asia for fear that they would join with Japan during the war. So there's a very large South Korean population in Central Asia. And you can see that anytime you go to one of the markets, because there will be special stands with South Korean kimchi and all kinds of good vegetables and meats and everything else. So in any case, C5 plus 1. What the countries have started to do is since 2017 meet only in the C5 format without a plus 1. So the countries are getting their presidents together, usually about once a year. They're not moving forward in making any kind of a union of this area, but what they're doing is looking at ASEAN over in Southeast Asia as a model. They're looking at the Nordic Council up on the Baltic Sea as another model. Most interesting, within the past 6 months, what they've started to do is invite the president of Azerbaijan to meet with them. And so it's now the C5 plus Azerbaijan. And sooner or later, it will be Georgia and Armenia too. And what that's going to do is build connectivity across this entire region that no one has seen in the modern era. Well, I've been blathering on for a very long time here. It's already getting quite late. I'm going to turn it back over to Trudy and our other folks here. And any questions you want to pass along to me, I'd be glad to answer or comment further, whatever you like. It's up to you guys now.
Well, thank you, Ambassador. That was just a wonderful overview of a very complicated part of the world. We have questions in the chat we're going to get to. But before that, I'd like you to talk a little bit about refugees, because these countries have refugees from Afghanistan. I assume they've got Uyghurs coming in from China. What's the refugee policy look like there?
That's a good question. And it's sort of tough. They do have refugees from Afghanistan, not as many as you would have thought, really. But unlike Pakistan, which is forcing them all out, uh, the countries of Central Asia are pretty welcoming to those who need help. That's sort of how they look at it. And you're right, the Uyghurs of China, they are Central Asians by ethnicity. They are mostly in Kazakhstan. They have a little bit of a harder time there, not because there is, it's because people are afraid that they're going to mess up the economy if they give them too much local power and authority. But by and large, there aren't all that many real serious ethnic problems and refugee problems throughout the entire region. If you cross the Caspian, then you get into Armenia and Azerbaijan, and then you've got a really big problem, but that's a very specific problem. And that's a totally different conversation.
Okay, let's start to take questions out of the chat. The first one was, are women educated the same as men in the countries you're discussing? Do they have equal rights?
Absolutely. That was one of the things that was quite amazing at their independence. The even though their cultures, their Turkic cultures, their Mongol cultures were male centric, the Soviet Union, one of the things it did right was make sure that there were equal rights and equal opportunities for men and women. And that was true in Central Asia. And you have already seen that there have been high level leaders, female leaders in Central Asia, uh, highly educated women in the business sector. So there's a surprising amount of equality there.
Okay, the next question is, how does that incredibly complicated border between Kirghizstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan, which is gerrymandered, certainly, affect relations between them?
It causes problems. In fact, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan over the past 30 years have been working to try to get what are called exclaves and enclaves. Little bits of the countries are scattered in the other countries, as well as being wrapped around each other like that. And so there is still violence that occurs, at least between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. Uzbekistan and Tajikistan in that area have pretty much settled their border problems now. But what the Soviets did was this was a classic example of divide and conquer. Because that whole area where you see them wrapped together is called the larger version of it is the Fergana Valley. And all of the ethnicities were living together pretty much in peace at that time. But when the Soviets came into the region, what they did was begin to divvy it up. This is your area, that's your area. Oops, sorry, we forgot about you. You're over here. Oops, no, you're up there. And it got really messy. But they did it for divide and conquer.
Okay, the next one, I'm going to take two together here. What's the weather like in the area outside the mountains? And are most of the people in these countries Muslim?
Okay, wonderful questions. What is the weather like? The weather is surprisingly like the United States because it's that central zone across the globe. And so there is spring, summer, fall, and winter. Now, as you go north into Kazakhstan, okay, you're going to get into a much colder winter. The capital of Kazakhstan, Astana, is way up in the steppes of southern Siberia. And oh my goodness, it would start snowing the 1st of October, and there'd be snow on the ground until the 1st of May. Uh, a warm day in Astana in the winter would be 10 below zero and would often get down to 20, 30, 40 below zero. But once you get out of that southern winter corridor up there into the rest of the Central Asia, it's very much like the United States. It's much like ours. Now, the other question was, remind me again, sorry.
Sure. Muslim.
Yeah. Okay, wonderful question. The majority of the population of Central Asia is Muslim, but not hardcore Muslim. It's a cultural Islam more than anything else. There are from time to time some extremist groups, like Uzbekistan has had some Islamic extremist groups. The ISIS has declared the Caliphate of Khorasan, which is part of Central Asia and Afghanistan. But by and large, it's a very, very laid back kind of Islam. I'll tell you, one thing I had to learn when I went there was when I would go to dinner parties, I had to learn how to toast hard with vodka. And not just a sip, every toast of when you're toasting there, and it's a cultural thing. You have to empty the glass. When I was working in Turkmenistan, and we'd have some kind of official dinner where the president of Turkmenistan was available, he would insist that you hold your glass upside down to prove that you had had the entire toast. So I learned over a period of time that if the vodka was clean and high quality, I could probably do 6 toasts in an evening, except the one thing that I always told myself and all of my staff was you never want to slur in public. If you feel that you're getting to the point where you might be doing something like that, then you find a way to excuse yourself and get out of there.
Very good advice. Here's a complicated one. Could you comment on the current Nagorno-Karabakh situation?
Okay, there we go. In the former Soviet Union, there were, or there are still, things called prolonged conflicts. These were quite often ethnic conflicts, border conflicts that Russia kept alive, didn't want to have settled after independence because it was more likely to keep those countries in Russia's hip pocket then if they had those problems. For example, in the country of Georgia, there were 2 breakaway regions, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, 2 prolonged conflicts. In Moldova, there was Transnistria, another prolonged conflict. And then probably the most violent one of all was Nagorno-Karabakh. And this was Armenia claiming parts of Azerbaijan. After I officially retired in 2015, end of 2015, in 2017, before our former president killed the program for rehiring, I was hired by the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe as the US co-chair for something called the Minsk Group to negotiate Nagorno-Karabakh. And what this is was Armenia had occupied an entire territory of Western Azerbaijan because it declared that that was the birthplace of Armenia 2,000 years ago. That was the soul of Armenia. And there was fighting in the 19th century. There was fighting in the early 20th century. At After independence, there was really terrible fighting going on there, and it went on and on and on. So this Minsk group that I was a part of was set up to negotiate. But what I found during that time, and our group was headed by a wonderful Polish ambassador. What I found at that time, and I never said it in public out loud at that time, was that there's no way that this is ever going to be negotiated in a peaceful way. It's going to be settled by war. And it was settled by war. Azerbaijan became rich enough that it was able to buy the weapons that it needed, a lot of them coming from Israel, by the way, that it could move quickly and take all of Nagorno-Karabakh. Now, when the Armenians originally took Nagorno-Karabakh, they devastated the place. The villages, the towns, the farmhouses were just a few stones standing. And what it caused was 600,000 displaced Azerbaijanis in their own country. What you hear now, that finally the tables have turned, is that there are 100,000 displaced Armenians. And oh, isn't that sad? Isn't that awful? Well, yes, of course it is. Absolutely. Whenever something like that happens and disrupts people's lives, it's ghastly. But we aren't hearing that much about what happened before that. And I'm going to take a risk here and tell you one reason why I think that's true. A lot of the way that the United States sees this particular issue is colored by one of the radical Armenian diaspora political groups. This is a group that's been involved with Senator Menendez for a very long time. It's a very deep hole that we don't want to go down at this time. But in any case, yes, Nagorno-Karabakh possibly is on its way to peace for the first time in well over 100 years. I probably said too much there and not enough that you wanted to hear. So there it is.
Okay, we've got lots of other questions and we're not going to get to them all. But one that I see that is particularly interesting, I think, is curiosity about how the war in Ukraine is impacting these countries.
One way that it's impacting them is that it's encouraging them to work together more than they ever have before. Because some of them look over their shoulders toward Moscow and say, oh my God, if it could happen in Ukraine, it could happen here too. Look, the northern third of that huge country of Kazakhstan, Russia has already claimed that as part of its own territory. There was a crazy member of the Russian Duma, Zhirinovsky, who used to say that this is my country and I will invade it myself if I have to. So the countries are quite afraid of what might come in the future. And so for that reason, they're finding more and more ways to quietly work together, not against Russia. I don't mean to imply that, but they're finding ways to build their own connectivity, their own cooperation, so that they can stand firmly together if ever need be. That's important to them.
One person says the U.S. used the Cosmodrome to launch satellites using rockets. And we certainly see Kazakhstan in the news when various of these missions go out. Has that changed our relationship with Kazakhstan?
No, not really. I had the great honor of going to the Cosmodrome once to watch a rocket go off with some of our astronauts and some of the European astronauts. But it was quite interesting because Russia controls that bit of territory around the Cosmodrome, even to this very day. It's technically part of Kazakhstan, but it's controlled by Russia. And so, as the US ambassador, I wasn't allowed to fly directly there. I had to fly to Moscow, get permission in Moscow, and then fly back down to the Cosmodrome. And then instead of, when it was over, when the event was over, instead of going back home the same day, no, I had to fly back up to Moscow, get a new visa, and then go back down. But that that Cosmodrome isn't used as much anymore, but we still have good relations with them over that. Yes.
And a final one, this person says, your explanation of different countries demonstrates the importance of the individual leader at key moments in each country's smart guys versus old style autocrats.
Well, that's really true, but some of those old style autocrats really surprised us when they got into a position of power. And I'm thinking more than anyone else of Nazarbayev of Kazakhstan. But then much more recently, if you think of Mirziyoyev, the second president, the current president of Uzbekistan, once again, those reforms just come spewing out when the opportunity exists. But it's not as if they were agitating behind the scenes to make that happen. They were good, loyal apparatchiki until they gained power, and then all at once they could do as they pleased. And in some cases, they did a pretty good job as they pleased.
Well, thank you, Ambassador. We're clear that you're a smart guy. You're not one of the old style diplomats. And we're really glad that you were with us tonight. Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us. And remember, on December 11, we're going to be talking about acting with Michael Toledo. Good night, everybody.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful. I appreciate it.